Welcome back to 1834, chess friends. It's the unofficial World Chess Championship between McDonnell and Bourdonnais. Don't worry if you're joining us for the very first time today, because the scores are completely even at 1 match all. So let's see how they get on in match 3, game 1. McDonnell starts with e4, and of course in the very previous game that was played, Bourdonnais played the Sicilian and then lost, so he decides to avoid that and plays e5 instead. And McDonnell plays f4, going for the King's Gambit. Bourdonnais is a gentleman, so he accepts the gambit, as all gentlemen must, and we have knight to f3 and then g5, giving some backup to this f-pawn. Now, McDonnell develops his light square bishop, and Bourdonnais keeps pushing his pawn and threatens to pick up the knight. Now, interestingly here, McDonnell decides that gambiting only his f-pawn is for weaklings, so he gambits his knight as well. He plays knight to c3 and Bourdonnais just picks up the knight, so a very interesting tactic here from McDonnell. He captures back with the queen, and now if you look carefully, well, not even carefully, it's just plain, he's got 3 pieces out already, nicely developed, whereas Bourdonnais's got all his pieces still on the back rank and an awkward looking pawn, so maybe this will work out for McDonnell. Now, our new guest commentator, Mr. Jack Hackett, told me earlier, when he was sober, that d6 would have been a good move for Bourdonnais at this point. But Bourdonnais doesn't play that, he plays queen to f6 instead, and McDonnell immediately attacks it with his knight. And you'll see that this knight's also threatening this pawn, which would be a fork leading to the capture of the rook in the corner. So Bourdonnais moves his queen to e5 to defend the pawn, and McDonnell just plays c3. He's looking to push this d4 pawn and gain a very strong centre. In fact, the only way for Bourdonnais to protect this pawn would be to move his king to d8 now. But Bourdonnais doesn't realise this, and he just develops his bishop to h6 instead. And this enables McDonnell to gain a lot of free development. In fact, Mr. Jack Hackett says that McDonnell's now winning by a substantial margin, which will only increase over the next few moves. So of course he plays d4 and attacks the queen, and so the queen has to move. It goes to d6, still trying to keep an eye on this pawn, but now McDonnell pushes e5 and threatens the queen again, and again the queen has to move. It goes to c6. And McDonnell spots that if he moves his bishop to b5, which he does, and attacks the queen again, the queen can't take it here because it'll be picked up with the fork here instead of the rook, which would be very nice for McDonnell. So after this bishop move, we have queen over to g6 to get out of the danger, and Bourdonnais has to give up the rook. So the knight captures the pawn, delivers the check, and we have king to d8, a few moves too late, and of course McDonnell picks up the rook. And now Bourdonnais plays knight to e7, trying to get some more of his pieces developed and into the game, and McDonnell just castles. Now here, its castling might be a little bit risky because this is a semi-open file down which Bourdonnais can put some major pieces, and of course he just moves his rook to g8 straight away, threatening this pawn. It's okay at the moment because the queen and the king are both protecting it, but we'll see how this continues. We have bishop back to d3 from McDonnell, attacking the queen now, and we have queen back to g7, so keeping nicely lined up in front of the king here. b4 from McDonnell, and now knight to g6 from Bourdonnais. He's probably hoping to get some more pieces headed over towards the castled king on this side. But McDonnell just neutralises that knight straight away. The queen captures back, and McDonnell pushes his pawn to b4. Maybe he's trying to mount some sort of rescue attempt for this knight that's stuck in the corner, not going anywhere. d6 from Bourdonnais, and McDonnell just keeps pushing his b-pawn. And Bourdonnais doesn't want to capture it back because that would just let the knight out straight away. So instead he pushes his pawn past the white pawn. And now the e-pawn captures on d, and the knight comes out to c6. So Bourdonnais is still struggling to get his pieces into active play. We now have d7, and the bishop just captures it, and now the knight comes out to c7, and Bourdonnais plays his bishop to g4 and attacks the queen. So the queen comes to d5, which gives a check, and so the king heads towards the corner to c8. Now here, Jack says that to maintain his significant lead, McDonnell must capture the pawn with the rook, and then after the bishop captures the rook and the bishop captures the bishop, he'll be fine. But instead, McDonnell loses all but a tiny fraction of his lead by playing the bishop captures instead. So I'll show you why this is. After this, the bishop comes to e6 and threatens the queen, and now the knight captures the bishop, and the f-pawn captures the knight, The queen comes back to f3, and the bishop captures the bishop here. Now, the queen can't capture the bishop back here because of this checkmate threat. Of course, you capture the bishop, it's all over. So that's why you should have captured with the rook instead of the bishop a few moves before. So what does he do? He plays rook on a to e1, getting on this semi-open file, and Bourdonnais just pushes the pawn. Now here, Jack says that pushing g3 would be the best move, but instead McDonnell plays his king to h1, and now the game is drawing. So McDonnell has lost all of the advantage that he managed to obtain with his interesting opening. Father Jack says arse. Queen to h6, again threatening checkmate here, so McDonnell blocks with his queen, which also comes with a check, so a queen exchange is forced. Queens come off the board, and McDonnell is left with weirdly doubled wing pawns here. But let's count the material, see how they're getting on. Well, Bourdonnais got a knight and a bishop for a rook, and he's got 4 pawns to McDonnell's 6, so let's see how the game proceeds. We have bishop to d2, which threatens this pawn and the rook, and there's no way to defend this pawn without giving up your rook. So we have rook to d1, and of course the bishop captures this pawn, and Bourdonnais won a pawn back. He's got 4 pawns to McDonnell's 5, and of course the wing pawns are looking slightly dodgy here. McDonnell doesn't want to lose another pawn to the bishop, so he pushes it and threatens the knight, so the knight moves and threatens the pawn back, although it is defended by the rook, so it's probably safe. McDonnell brings his other rook up to attack the knight, so the bishop defends it, and McDonnell just pushes his pawn again. Of course, this can't be captured by the bishop because it is defended by this rook. And now this pawn is attacking the knight, so the knight moves to c6, which enables the rook to come into c7 to deliver a check. And the king starts heading towards the corner. And this gives McDonnell a chance to pick up this wing pawn here and go 2 pawns up again. So very nice, although he has a rook for a knight and a bishop, so it's not completely winning just yet. Bourdonnais notices that he himself has a pass pawn too and starts pushing it towards promotion. He goes to e4. And now we have rook to h4 to try to delay this pawn, but it just keeps coming to e3. We have now rook to e4 getting behind it, ready to pick it up, but the bishop goes to c5 and defends it now. It's looking a little bit more secure. We have d7 from McDonnell. It's his turn to go for the promotion, although this square is looking like it's nicely defended by both the rook and the knight. So who will be able to get through first? Let's find out. Now, Bourdonnais decides to physically block the path of the pawn to the queening square with his rook, but McDonnell doesn't mind. He's got more passed pawns on the wing to push, which he does, h4. Meanwhile, he's left this one here undefended, so Bourdonnais captures it with the bishop, but McDonnell just keeps pushing his wing pawn. We have king to c7. He's wanting to double up on this pawn and get rid of this danger, but again, McDonnell keeps pushing, and he's now only 2 squares away from queening on this side of the board. A good move for Bourdonnais to deal with this would be bishop to d4, which not only defends the corner square, but it blocks the defense of this rook on the white pawn, and it would enable Bourdonnais to very cleanly pick up this pawn with no danger. But he doesn't play this. Instead, he plays his own pawn to e2, which is a bit strange because it just gives it up immediately, so McDonnell is very happy to capture it here. And we now have bishop to d4, maybe a little bit too late, but it is again helping defend this corner square, and it is defended by the knight, so it's not going to be captured anytime soon. But again, McDonnell pushes his pawn. He's now 1 square away from the corner square, although of course there are 2 defenders. He's not going to get there immediately, but we'll see what happens. Bourdonnais captures the pawn with his king, and let's just take a moment to count the material. Bourdonnais's got a knight and a bishop for a rook, and he's got 2 connected pawns to McDonnell's 3 very spaced out pawns, and 2 of these pawns are doubled, and this one is very close to castling, so it's actually even on material, so it's hard to say who's going to win from here. Let's continue. We have rook to g2 from McDonnell, and now rook to h8 from Bourdonnais, again physically blocking the path of the pawn from the queening square, and it's backed up by this bishop, which is also defended by the knight. So nice stuff. We have rook to g7 with check, and no, Bourdonnais can't capture the rook with the bishop here because the bishop's pinned by the other rook, so very nicely played from McDonnell. Bourdonnais decides he doesn't want to bring his king back to the back rank in the corner here to defend the pawn. He would prefer an active king, so he brings it forward to d6, and McDonnell is very pleased indeed to be able to pick up another pawn. And now the king keeps moving, king to c5, and here McDonnell decides that he would also like an active king, so he moves his to g2. And Bourdonnais attacks the rook, so the rook moves across to d7, and now it's performing a double attack on the bishop. So Bourdonnais defends it with his knight, and here McDonnell simply pushes his other pawn up the wing to h4. Now here Bourdonnais decides to exchange down and try to get into a drawing endgame. He threatens the rook with the king, and this just leads to an exchange of all the pieces on d4, like so. And you'll notice that this pawn is now undefended, so Bourdonnais is able to capture this. So after the dust has settled, they're both left with a rook each, but McDonnell has an extra pawn. So it'll be interesting to see how Bourdonnais goes about trying to draw this while McDonnell tries to win it. First of all, McDonnell uses his king to help protect the pawn, and Bourdonnais attacks the white rook, which retreats to d2, allowing Bourdonnais to advance his pawn one square. McDonnell brings his king one square forward, hoping to assist his own pawn forward, but meanwhile the black pawn is uninhibited and keeps coming. So McDonnell pushes his rook to d3, maybe hoping to slow it down a little bit. So Bourdonnais brings his rook across to b7, and McDonnell can advance his pawn one square. He's now 3 squares away from queening. In the meantime, the rook comes down to b4, delivers a check. Now, if I was playing this game with McDonnell's position, I'd think about advancing my king above the line of attack of the rook and sticking with this pawn to assist it across to the other side. But it turns out that McDonnell is terrible at endgames, and he retreats it below the line of attack to g3, so it's now separated from the pawn and can't assist it anymore. And the game is completely drawing. And the drawing move here for Bourdonnais would be to bring his rook to b2 to attack the pawn. Then after the pawn goes to a3, bring the rook up to b3 here, and this is just completely drawing. If the rook captures the rook, the pawn captures back, and then Bourdonnais will queen, whilst McDonnell will queen immediately afterwards, and then it's just a drawn endgame. If the rook doesn't capture and comes back to here because it's pinned, you can't just leave it out in the open here just to be captured, then the black king will head over this way, and it'll just be a sort of repeating move stalemate thing with nobody able to gain anything either way. However, it turns out that Bourdonnais is also terrible at endgames, and he did not spot this rook to b2 move. Instead, he played rook to b1, and the endgame continues. Rook to d2 to keep an eye on this pawn, and the black rook comes across and delivers check. The white rook blocks, and now Bourdonnais doesn't want to capture it here because after the king captures back, this white pawn will just be queening. So instead he moves out of the way to h1 to threaten the pawn. Again, the white rook blocks, so the same thing applies, and again it's a check from the black rook. But McDonnell isn't interested in just repeating moves and getting a draw. He wants to win, so he does something different. He moves his king to h4, and now the rook comes back up to g8. He doesn't want to be left out in the lurch if the pawn advances, and indeed the pawn advances. We now have king to b4. Bourdonnais would like to threaten this pawn and maybe even try to get his own pawn across. That would be very good for him and for all the Bourdonnais fans, and I'm sure there are some. I mean, I do like him too. It's just that he's my second favourite player. We have now king to h5. King to a3, getting up close to that white pawn, and the other white pawn moves to h7, just 1 square away from queening and threatening the rook. So, of course, the rook moves out of the way to b8 while still keeping an eye on the queening square. And now we have king to g5. And you might have realized by this point that the reason I called this video Long Live the King is because it's a really long game with many, many moves. The black rook comes down to check the king, and again, the king should move above the line of attack of the rook and assist the pawn in becoming a queen. Once it becomes a queen, the black rook will be forced to capture it, at which point it will be captured back itself by either the king or the white rook. Of course, the black king can capture this pawn at that point, but the remaining king and rook in combination will be able to pick up the black pawn and checkmate the king. And McDonnell doesn't go for this plan. It's like he doesn't know what to do, or maybe he knows exactly what to do and he's just enjoying playing with Bourdonnais, because instead of going up, he goes down to f4 and heads towards this bottom left corner. So there are a lot of moves here. I'm just going to go through them pretty quickly so as not to waste time. Rook back to b8 to keep an eye on the queening square. King to e4. rook to e8 with check, king to d3, rook to d8 again with check, and now king to c2. Rook to h8, getting up behind the pawn, and king to b1, king to b4, rook to h4 with check, the king moves to c3, and the rook checks again, so back to c4, king to b2, and king to b4, and now McDonnell is able to push the pawn with check. And it seems like McDonnell is managing to push the king back up the board, so let's hope he's able to continue with this. King to c4, check again from the rook, king to b5, king to c3, and now Bourdonnais has a chance to give a check, so the king moves back to b2. And Bourdonnais doesn't like his rook being out here away from blocking the pawn, so he immediately moves it back again, rook to h8. Rook to b4 with check. He's left this pawn undefended now, but the king has to move first, so he does so, and then the white rook defends the pawn again. The king threatens the rook, so the rook moves across to g7, and now we have king back to a5. The white king comes up to c3, and now rook to c8 with check again, and king to d4. And the black rook has to go back to h8. If he doesn't, then the rook will stand in front, and then it'll be all over. So he goes to h8, and now we have rook to g5, leaving the defense of the pawn, but this comes with check, so the king has to move, and the rook defends the pawn again. Now you'll see that the black king has been separated from his defense of this black pawn. The rook's cutting across the center of the board, and the king will be able to just come across and pick up the pawn. So nicely done, McDonnell. So let's just continue with the moves. King to c6, king to c4, king to b6, king to b4, king to c6, and well done, McDonnell, you've captured the last black pawn. Now we have king to b6 again, rook to h6 with check, king to c5, and McDonnell plays his king to a5, which looks extremely sketchy because the black rook can come across, which it does, slice down the wing here. The black king is protecting all of these squares, so it's almost checkmate. There's only one move for McDonnell, which is to block with the white rook, which is what he does. And Bourdonnais, of course, can't exchange the rooks here because the white pawn will queen. So rook to b8, and here McDonnell plays a massive blunder that draws the game. He plays a4. So what's the deal here? Well, after Bourdonnais plays rook to h8, then the white king is blocked in, it can't move, and the pawns can't move. The white rook can't come here because it'll just be a win for Bourdonnais with checkmate. The white rook can't move along this line because if it does, the black rook can come across and deliver a check, and the only move for McDonnell is to bring his rook back to defend, and you'll just repeat until you're bored and you agree to a draw. So the only move in this position is rook to a7 and defend the pawn. But if that happens, then rook to c8, and amazingly in this position the only move for McDonnell is to queen and give up the queen immediately to the rook. For example, you can't move the rook up here because it'll just be checkmate again. If you move it along this line, again it'll just be checkmate because after the check the only move is to block, and this time it's not defended by anything, it's checkmate. So quite an amazing position. So McDonnell would have to give up the queen, and after you capture, then the rook comes across to c7, for example, king to d6 to attack the rook can come down to c2, black rook can come across to b8, rook to c1, and we're just going to repeat the position. We're just going to shuffle our rooks around and not make any progress in any direction at all. So drawing. However, Bourdonnais did not find this rook to h8 move. Instead, he played rook to c8, and McDonnell still has a chance to win. Long live the king. We have rook to a7 now, and rook to b8, rook to c7 with check, and the king moves to d6, threatens the rook. Now the rook retreats to c1, but the key difference here between what we saw with the variation just now is that there's still a pawn on the wing here, and it's going to be impossible for Bourdonnais to watch both pawns on the left and right side of the board at once. So he plays a check here, rook to a8, so the king moves aside whilst keeping an eye on the defense of the pawn. The rook checks again, and the king comes forward this time. The rook checks again, and McDonnell does not retreat. He keeps coming forward. He comes to b7 to attack the rook. He's left the defense of this pawn, but it's okay. If the rook were to take this pawn, this other pawn would become a queen, and it would all be over for Le Bourdonnais. And he can't leave the rook here because it's just going to get captured by the king. So he brings it over to h8, and McDonnell brings his rook over to h1 to defend here. And it was here, after 99 moves, that Le Bourdonnais resigned the first game of the third match to leave McDonnell up 1-0. So awesome stuff. Why did he resign? Well, as we said, he can't keep an eye on both these pawns. This one is now just free to travel up the side of the board. The king's protecting all the squares in this area, and this rook is protecting the pawn on the right wing. So awesome stuff. Well done, McDonnell. This was an epic game. It took me multiple days of preparation and filming to record this. I'm glad you joined me. I think it was worth it. I'll see you again to see what happens in match 2.